Right now, take a look at the screen of your smartphone. Tech conglomerates have crammed dozens of applications into it. You have access to streaming platforms with tens of thousands of titles and millions of hours of podcasts covering every conceivable corner of life. The entire entertainment repository of human history fits right in the palm of your hand. Yet, how many times have you put that device down, let out a heavy sigh, and realized that you are still bored? That is a profound paradox of our era. We are suffocating in a system of overwhelming stimulation, yet we remain entirely empty of true satisfaction. So, let's ask a fundamental question that history textbooks rarely address. When boredom struck, what exactly did ancient humans do to cope with it? Hold on, we aren't talking about the citizens of the Roman Empire or the brilliant dynasties of ancient Egypt. Let's go back much further than that. Let's rewind 100,000, maybe 200,000 years. That was an era of primal emptiness. There were no screens, no written systems, no defined concepts of art or music, and certainly no complex language. There were just people sitting there, facing hours upon hours with absolutely nothing to do. How did they handle that terrifying silence? In reality, what they did during those dead hours completely shatters our traditional assumptions about human creativity, the roots of religion, and most importantly, it reveals the truth about why your brain is wired to operate the way it does today. Before we dive into what our ancestors created, there is a massive cognitive barrier we need to dismantle. Did boredom actually exist in the primitive world? Or is it just a privileged disease of modern times? For a long time, academia and scientists were stuck in a rigid prejudice. We defaulted to picturing our early ancestors as creatures constantly pushed to the very brink of survival. The traditional perspective always painted a picture where every waking hour of prehistoric humans was drained by a life or death struggle, hunting dangerous beasts, searching for water, or rushing to build shelters against the harsh elements. Through that lens, there simply was no room for the luxury called free time. But like many historical misconceptions, that assumption completely collapsed when actual data was brought to light. In 1966, anthropologist Marshall Salins published a groundbreaking study that flipped the scientific community's entire belief system about the Stone Age on its head. He had spent years observing and analyzing the lifestyle of the Kung people in the Kalahari Desert, one of the rare human populations on Earth at the time, still maintaining an original way of life, closest to the roots of humanity. The data Salins collected did not reflect a life of miserable struggle. On the contrary, it pointed to a reality that would make anyone grinding in today's modern economy envious. On average, these hunter-gatherers spent only about 15 to 20 hours per week on activities required for survival. You heard that right. 15 to 20 hours for an entire week, not a day. So, what did they do with that massive surplus of time? The answer is incredibly simple. They rested. They sat next to each other. They observed the world around them, or they simply did nothing in particular. Salins gave them a title that was both ironic and accurate: the original affluent society. Affluence here wasn't measured by the accumulation of material wealth, but by the most expensive asset of all, time. It turns out, the people we call primitive held an amount of free time far beyond what a 21st century human could ever dream of. Therefore, the scientific lens had to shift. The question was no longer whether ancient humans got bored. They absolutely did. The true question that shapes our evolutionary history is, when faced with those endless stretching afternoons, what did they do to liberate their brains? When confronted with a surplus of time, what was the very first reflex of our ancestors? Surprisingly, the answer is remarkably simple. They began to play. But the concept of play here carries a historical weight far heavier than you might think. In 2010, during an excavation at a site called Blombos Cave in South Africa, archaeologist Francesco De Rico and his team discovered an incredibly strange collection of shells. They dated back 75,000 years. We are often taught by our educational systems that every artifact created by ancient humans was meant for survival. However, these shells dealt a crushing blow to that viewpoint. They were intentionally pierced with holes and coated in red ochre powder. Let's analyze this for a second. You couldn't use them to cut food. You couldn't use them as spearheads to hunt, and you certainly couldn't chew them to fill your stomach. So, what were they? They were beads. In other words, someone 75,000 years ago, during an endlessly long afternoon with nothing better to do, sat down and crafted jewelry for themselves. That is the oldest known art object recorded in human history, and it was born from a moment of boundless boredom. But the most astonishing detail lies in the crafting process itself. Try to put yourself in the shoes of that nameless artisan. There were no mechanical drills, no sharp metal points, and absolutely no brain trained for focus through modern forms of entertainment. Diligently using a crude piece of stone to grind through a tough shell required hours, maybe days, of tedious labor. Why did they pour their energy into something that seemed so useless? Because the only alternative was sitting huddled in the corner of a cave, staring at the cold stone walls. People often repeat the saying, "Necessity is the mother of invention," implying that the pressure to survive is the spark that ignites innovation. That might be true for hunting tools, but not for art. It was the silence, the emptiness, and the absolute extreme of boredom that forced the brain to generate beauty of its own accord. And this paradigm of creativity, born from emptiness, didn't stop at visual arts. It manifested brilliantly in music. In 2008, during the excavation of a cave in southern Germany, researchers found an artifact that shattered all historical preconceptions: a flute. It was meticulously crafted from the bone of a griffon vulture, with 5 precisely carved finger holes. The age of this instrument? A staggering 40,000 years. Let's pause for a beat to picture that setting. 40,000 years ago, long before the birth of agriculture, before any concept of villages or cities, and before any civilization we could name, a nameless individual sat down and invented music. They didn't do it because of natural pressures or some grand mandate for survival. They did it simply because they had an endlessly free afternoon and a bird bone in their hands. The presence of this flute led the scientific community to a stunning conclusion. Music is exactly what the brain automatically produces when it has no urgent survival information left to process. Neuroscientist Daniel Levitin, a leading expert researching the origins of music, presented a bold yet entirely grounded argument. Human musical appreciation evolved before language. According to him, our neural networks were intricately designed to respond to melodies long before we could string syllables together into a complex sentence. Why is that? The foundation lies in a core mechanism of life: pattern recognition. When our ancestors were in a state of safety, free from the threat of predators or starvation, their brains, a massive energy-consuming machine, began to starve for information. It craved something to analyze. When they produced those first sounds, the brain began playing with frequencies. It sought an orderly arrangement within the chaos of nature, becoming intoxicated by the variations in rhythm, the unexpected accents, and syncopations. Pattern recognition, which once served as a radar helping our ancestors spot predators, was repurposed to become the wellspring of the purest auditory experiences. Art, once again, was born from the void of silence. But if boredom had only resulted in making necklaces or a few primitive melodies, human history would have taken a very different path. The reality is, emptiness invented a weapon tens of thousands of times more powerful. It invented imagination. You cannot feel bored if you lack one fundamental concept: the concept of time. A well-behaved dog lying flat by the door waiting for its owner to return from work isn't bored. From a neurobiological standpoint, it is simply in a waiting state. It doesn't possess the concept that I could be doing something much more exciting right now. Humans are different. For your brain to emit the bored signal, you must perceive that the current moment is dragging on too slowly. You must be conscious of a future that hasn't happened yet, and envision that this future could be better. Boredom is the very first sign that a brain has evolved far enough to conceptualize things that do not yet exist. Picture them sitting with their knees pulled to their chests in a cold cave, staring blankly into the dying embers of a fire. With no immediate survival threats, the brain begins to slip away from reality. It projects into space and time. It starts asking questions. What happens if the hunt fails tomorrow? Is that rustling sound out there just the wind or a stalking predator? What lies beyond that eternal snow-capped mountain? What are those sparkling lights above us? And where do our people go after they take their final breath? Every monumental question religion has ever tried to explain, every dilemma philosophy has debated, every mystery quantum physics or astronomy is still tirelessly trying to solve today. All of them began with someone, somewhere, in a moment of extreme tedium, letting their mind wander free. To prove this mechanism, look at a 2013 study by psychologist Dr. Sandy Mann. She asked candidates to perform a highly monotonous task, manually copying numbers from a telephone directory. The moment they were completely drained by the tedium, she gave them cognitive tests. The result? The group forced to endure boredom achieved creativity scores that utterly crushed all the control groups. Science has confirmed. When deprived of external stimuli, the brain is forced to activate an internal simulation machine. It generates its own world. But if we only sat alone and imagined, we would only have solitary philosophers. To build an entire civilization, those idle humans needed to do one more thing. They had to gossip. Anthropologist Robin Dunbar spent years researching and discovered something that might disillusion many. Roughly 65% of all human conversational time consists of social gossip and chit-chat. Who just did what? Who is crossing whom? At first glance, this sounds like a useless waste of time. But through the lens of evolutionary biology, it was a razor-sharp survival mechanism. Dunbar argues that language didn't evolve from a pragmatic need to exchange information. It evolved as the ultimate tool to forge social bonds. Before language, primates built trust by grooming each other and picking out lice, a time-consuming method strictly limited to a one-on-one ratio. Language is vocal grooming. Thanks to boredom and the need to fill empty time, you could just sit around a fire, simultaneously converse, and build trust with 3 or 4 people at once. You could establish shared moral codes, warn others about freeloaders, and shape a larger society. Language, and the entirety of human civilization, rose because our ancestors had too much free time, sat closely together, and started getting curious about the secrets of their peers. And so, we have come full circle. 75,000 years ago, a bored individual ground out a bead. 40,000 years ago, someone crafted a flute. And in the scattered empty spaces across the span of history, idle humans asked the questions that built religion and science. And today, that is you, lying awake at 2 a.m. with a mobile device in your hand, feeling aimless. There is a hidden truth. In psychology, the state we are forced to live in every day is called cognitive overload. When every empty moment is filled with a constant stream of stimulating information, the brain is robbed of the opportunity to process, consolidate, and create. The brain's default mode network, the region controlling deep empathy and imagination, is actually only activated when you are not focused on anything specific, meaning it only works when you let yourself be bored. Humanity spent over 300,000 years evolving to learn how to fill silence with profound meaning. Then we created smart devices and voluntarily surrendered that quiet space to algorithms. This system is not unbreakable. Every time you proactively put the screen down, reject immediate stimulation, and accept sitting with emptiness, you are performing the exact creative act of our ancestors. The very same psychological mechanism that made the bead, crafted the flute, and looked up at the stars to ask, why? Boredom has never been the anchor holding humanity back. It is the very thing that shaped the most human part inside of us. And if you allow it, it will liberate your mind right now.